Okay, having looked at the Malay world, let's now head eastward and take a look at the Philippines. So in Southeast Asia today is a country that we refer to as the Philippines. And it is an island nation made up of some 7,641 islands. How do I know that? Because I wrote it down right over there. Why else would I know how many islands there are in the Philippines? Other than that, there's a lot of them. And the fact that there are a lot of islands in the Philippines is important because it's one element that explains why the Philippines doesn't always fit with other parts of the region when we look at it historically. So when we look at the region historically, there are a few things that we can see in the big picture of things. One of them is periods of Indic contact and influence. So when looking at Srivijaya, for instance, and Langkasuka and Kedah, we saw that all of these were polities that at one point were sort of Hindu-Buddhist in their orientation. And that later leaders converted to Islam and they became sultanates. You don't have anything like that in the Philippines. We don't have signs of, say, monuments that were built for Hindu or Buddhist deities. There isn't evidence of the use of Indic scripts in the past. So it seems to be a place that kind of was not part of that general element of Southeast Asian history. Another thing that's different about the Philippines is that we don't have evidence of big or powerful polities there in the past. So when we get to the mainland, we'll see that in the mainland states and on the island of Java, there's a long history of big land-based kingdoms. Whereas in the Malay world, we saw that there were these powerful trading centers like Malacca and Srivijaya. In the Philippines, we don't have that. And so in these ways, the Philippines doesn't fit the kind of pattern that we find in other parts of Southeast Asia. In other ways, though, it is very similar. And if we could head into, say, the Philippines in, I don't know, the 1500s, what we would find would be a lot of similarities with places in, say, the Malay world that we just looked at. So across those 7,641 islands are spoken somewhere between 120 and 187 languages. And even though that sounds like an incredible linguistic diversity, those languages are all part of this Austronesian language family, the same language family that languages like Malay come from. And so in that way, on a linguistic level, there are things that the Philippines share with other parts of Southeast Asia, particularly the island world. Beyond language, if we were to head into, say, settlements in the Philippines in the past, we would find places that closely resembled Malay settlements that we looked at before. The Malay kampong, this kind of collection of buildings, often at a strategic location, say where a river flows into the sea, is also something that you would have found in the Philippines in the past. It wasn't called a kampong, it was called a barangay, but again, it would have been visually and spatially something very familiar to people from other parts of the island world. In terms of its political structure, it also would have been very similar as well. Each barangay would have a ruler who was known as a datu, that same term that we saw in use in Srivijaya in the past, and a term that is an Austronesian term. That datu would be powerful not because he possessed lots of land, but because he had control over many people. Because the Philippines, like other parts of Southeast Asia, was a place where land was more abundant than people, and that therefore the way to kind of gain power was by controlling people. The way that people in the Philippines did this was the same way that people in other parts of Southeast Asia did this. They did this by somehow either purchasing or enslaving some people and having them under like perpetual labor, but also by having other people in some form of debt bondage that required these people to provide varying degrees of labor. In the Philippines, I think the term for, or at least one term for this is alipin. But that single term covers kind of a range of different types of arrangements, as there were different levels of alipin who would require, some of them might live in their own home and come and work for a master. Some of them would live on the actual grounds of the person they were indebted to. Some people would live in the household, and they would have different levels of obligations to this person who they were indebted to and worked for. So again, that is something that was shared between the Philippines and other parts of Southeast Asia, particularly the island world. Another thing that was shared was belief in the spirits of the natural world. In the Philippines, as was the case in the Malay world and in the interiors and seas surrounding the Malay world, was a world that the indigenous people of the Philippines believed was filled with spiritual powers that had to be appeased, that had to be, taken into consideration. And there was all kinds of, local knowledge or indigenous knowledge about these spirits and the signals that they sent to human beings. So if you went for a hunt in the forest, for instance, and you heard the call of a certain type of bird, that could be a sign that this was not a good time to go for your hunt. And you might want to, for your own safety, return home. Similarly, leaving your home and seeing a certain type of lizard, for instance, might also be interpreted as a sign of something. And so the world was filled with these spirits and signs of these spirits that people tried to adapt their lives to. But when they did not have the means to do that themselves, there were people that they could rely on. Just as there were such people in the Malay world, the Bomo or the Dukun, so was there such people in the Philippines in the past, the Babaylan. What's interesting about the Babaylan, however, is that the Babaylan was usually female or perhaps third gender, a kind of feminized male. But these women performed the same function as, say, the Dukun did, or the Bomo in the Malay world, in that they could intervene between spirits and human beings. They could exorcise an evil spirit. If they decided to be evil themselves, they could put the evil spirit to evil uses, but they weren't supposed to do that. At least the good ones weren't. But they were, integral parts of, the communities in the Philippines in the past. Just as it was the case that the Dukun could not necessarily deal with all spirits, so was it the case in the Philippines that the Babaylan had to give up in the face of some powers. And this was particularly the case when she encountered spirits like the Aswang.
Hindi namin alam. Parang taong bayawak na dumadaan sa ilalim ng lupa. Ang tawag namin sa kanila, mga abwang.
Bilis! Hoy! Bumaba ka dyan! Ako ang hanapin mo!
Victor, ako na!
Ay, bumaba nga!
Aswang.
Aswang. Ang darling kong aswang.
Aswang is a term that can be used to refer to a variety of different ghosts that sometimes take different names in different parts of the islands, like Wak Wak is one such name. It is a spirit, though, that's similar to, say, the Pontianak in the Malay world, in that she can take the form of a woman who will come out at night and maybe not look very suspicious, but she can then transform. And in the case of the Philippines, sometimes she will take flight with these kind of bat wings that kind of go whack, 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 whack. Or she may transform into an animal, like an angry dog, and attack people as a vicious, angry dog. Either way, she's very, very dangerous. But there were spirits out there that were even more dangerous, and none more so than the Manananggal.
Manila, a beautiful city by day. By night, a winged creature wraps the city into darkness. The horror headline news is now a movie.
Sa lungsod ng Maynila, mayroon din pong isang babaeng manananggal sa barangay Sampaloc.
Pray for the woman's baby. Even the park ceases to be a playground for babies. Don't stay late in the disco. The girl you are dancing with might be a you-know-what. Lock your doors. Close the window. She's coming. The beauty in the beast. Beware of the neighbor across your house. Manananggal in Manila.
So the Manananggal is the same spirit as the Panangan in the Malay world, or also known as sometimes the Langsweer, this kind of ghost that takes the form of a woman whose head can disconnect from her body, and then she can go flying through the night looking for the blood of a newborn or something like that. And she has a long tongue that she can extend down to consume what it is that she's looking for. Indeed, some of the first feature films ever made in the Philippines were about these very beasts. There's an early movie called, Ang Aswang. There's another one called Ang Manananggal. And I think these movies are long lost now, but we know that they existed. And so it's interesting that when, Filipinos first started making films, one of the first things that came into their minds was, we got to make a horror movie. Another element that we would find shared between the Philippines and the Malay world is Islam. So today we think of the Philippines as a Catholic nation, as it is today predominantly Catholic. However, if we could go back to before the time where Catholicism was introduced, something we'll get to in a minute, we would find that Islam was starting to become established in the islands. And this is something that relates to the issues that we looked at in the Malay world last time. So we saw that in 1511, the Portuguese captured Malacca, and that there were various people from Malacca who then dispersed and tried to establish sultanates in different parts of the island world, or that there were sultanates who started to become more prominent at that time. Well, one person who tried to, or not only tried, but who did establish a sultanate was a guy by the name of Sharif Muhammad Kabungsuan. That term Sharif is an indication that this person had connections through descent with people in the Middle East and was perhaps himself Arab or of Arab descent. But in the early 1500s, this guy traveled from the area of Malacca all the way through the islands to the southern Philippine island of Mindanao, where I think he married a local princess and established a sultanate there, beginning a process of the Islamicization of the island of Mindanao, which is now a southern island in the Philippines. That is a process, however, that was already underway in the islands of the Sulu archipelago, where in the 1400s, there was a guy, I think about 1405, roughly around the time that Malacca was established. There was a guy by the name of Sharif ul Hashim. He has a much longer name, but that was his royal name, established a sultanate there and began a process of Islamicization of the Sulu archipelago. By, say, the 1600s, the area of what is today Manila was home to a sultanate as well, as, there were various rulers who were converting, and Islam was gradually spreading towards the Philippines. A process, that there was every indication would have continued and would have made the Philippines much more closely aligned with the Malay world that we looked at last time. But there were some people who arrived on the scene and history changed course. And that's something we'll look at in the next video.